It's now mid-autumn in Tasmania, and that means, yes, that we cycle back to garlic planting time. Now, I'm not going to go into great details about planting garlic this time because I have done that in previous videos, and I'll put a link to those so that you can have a look at them. But what I wanted to talk about today was crop rotation. You'll note that where I'm planting the garlic today is in a different patch to where I planted it last year. This area, which now looks rather weedy and overgrown, that I need to clean up as part of the next stage of the rotation. But I have three main areas that I cultivate for larger scale crops, as well as another area of raised beds for smaller crops. And amongst them all I do crop rotation, but particularly amongst those larger areas. But is crop rotation even necessary? This little book I have here, Gardening Myths by Charles Dowding, is a great little book with some really good points in it. Charles Dowding is a man that I have considerable respect for. You can go and have a look at what he's growing on YouTube. He's got some really good videos there. But he talks about crop rotation, and I'll just read a small amount here to you. The 4-year cycle, he says, dates back 300 years to a system of rotation invented by Charles Townsend, where he replaced a fallow year and the traditional 3-year rotation with fertility building clover, and then added turnips to make it a 4-year rotation. Both the clover and turnips were food for animals whose droppings of manure added fertility. So that's really interesting in terms of the fact that 2 of the original 4-year cycle actually wasn't dedicated to the production of food for humans, but rather food for animals, where you're actually getting manure added to the soil. So in the methods that Charles Dowding uses, where he is adding a lot of compost to the soil on an annual basis, you don't need that type of cycle at all, and a 2-year cycle is sufficient. Now, I'm cultivating, I'm not adding compost here, so I work on a slightly different cycle, but I'm fertilizing the ground myself, not relying on animals to come along and do it for me. Now, a really good thing would be to add chickens, or chooks as we call them here in Australia, to the cycle and put them into your vegetable patch as part of a rotation cycle, so they would clean your garden up and fertilize it as well. So this gives you quite a few options, and basically you can design a system that works for you. In my garden I grow a lot of potatoes. I generally grow 2 crops of potatoes a year, and also I grow tomatoes. Now, being of the same family, I really try and keep these separated by another crop in between. And between crops, I actually also try to use some green manure to revitalise the soil, to add some more organic matter, and to assist in that break for the soil. The issues are not only fertility of the soil, but also disease, that you don't want disease building up. So particularly something like potatoes, if you're growing potatoes in the same soil year after year after year, you would potentially build up disease. Growing a crop like mustard and digging that in will fumigate the soil and reduce the disease in between those potato crops. But also breaking it with another crop in between, I think, is really, really beneficial. So where I'm planting the garlic here this year is where I've just grown potatoes. I actually mentioned that the potato crop that I grew in here was the best I've ever grown. I've got some videos if you want to look at those where I planted and harvested this crop. But I actually ended up harvesting around 140 kilos of potatoes off 30 square meters, which I thought was a pretty good result. Because of the complexity of the cropping and the fact that I have 3 different areas in my garden, I created a spreadsheet to keep track of it, and I'll show you how that works. Okay, this is the spreadsheet that I use. The first element that you'll see is that I've got the 3 sections that I grow my main crops in, and I further subdivide them into subsections because some areas like tomatoes don't need the full section, so it's good to be able to divide those down. Roughly these are the same size, generally around 15 to 20 square meters in each of the subsections. The second thing you'll notice is that my year, you'll hear 2017-18, actually is from September to August, so I'm going from what is spring here in Tasmania through to the next spring, because that's the main cycle in gardening, is spring to spring rather than our traditional year. In section 1 this year I began with some green manure tomatoes in one section and tried to grow some quinoa, but that was a total failure, so I'll need to modify that because the thing that actually grew in there in the end was potatoes, volunteer potatoes, and so that was the main crop, and they're still there and still to be dug. The section here where the garlic and broad beans were, and it was intended to grow potatoes, but because it was so dry that didn't actually happen, and I'm now going to put in some green manure. Where the potatoes have come out, you'll see that broad beans and garlic are going to follow. Now the green manure I'm sandwiching in between the main crops wherever I can to get some change in the soil. I think that it's the opportunity to grow some legumes. Now the interesting thing with legumes is that people often think of them as nitrogen fixing. However, the evidence seems to be that the main gain is only when you actually put the whole plant into the soil. So using them as green manure is the ideal way. You'll notice that I have some gap sections, and that allows me an area where I can experiment. In this next season I'm going to experiment with some watermelons in this area. So this allows me to visually track and remember really what I've grown, as long as I come back and update it from time to time, what I've grown and where I'm going next year through my cycle. So here in the raised beds, it's a much simpler rotation and fairly easy to remember. Basically, I group what I grow in beds in specific groups, and you'll see here in this one I have spring onions and leeks. So an allium family bed. I have had zucchinis in this one, which is now harvested and cleaned out. This one over the main summer has had broccoli in it. Yes. And here you'll see beetroot, carrots, now silver beet, parsnips and so on. What I basically do in the rotation here is to move each year what I grow in this bed to the next bed, and so I count this as bed 1, the last one over there is bed 8, and just move it through. So that means it's 8 years between growing the same vegetable, generally speaking, in each bed. From a nutritional perspective, it's not really necessary for me to do this because I am adding compost to these beds and quite a large amount of nutrition each year. But I think from a disease point of view, it's a really good idea to actually keep that rotation moving. Again, I use my spreadsheet for these beds. It just allows me to keep track of what I've put in, and also to make some notes about results if I need to, time of planting, what worked best. It's a way of keeping track of things. So this is the spreadsheet that I used for the raised beds. I originally designed this, I began by listing here the main vegetables that I grow in the raised beds and putting them into their various groups, and then looking across all the different beds and giving them the opportunity to cycle through. So if you look across here diagonally, each year one is moving across. Now these years were basically years that are spring to spring, because I look at spring planting. This plan hasn't really looked into some of the subsequent plantings that may occur in autumn. I've just focused on the spring planting. While I base the cycle in these beds on an annual basis and count it from spring to spring generally, I do plant some autumn crops, as you see here, that I've got some spinach and some cabbages growing. Now the spinach can come out and be cleared away, ready for the carrots to come in whenever that's ready. The cabbage might delay the next planting, so that I might have to adjust my cycle a little bit, and I think you always need to be prepared to do that. Not always reasonable to expect that the crop is going to end precisely at the predicted time, because you may not have harvested it all. But in little beds like this you can have patchy planting. It doesn't have to be one bed, whole bed. You can grow things mixed up. It's not going to be a really big problem, because you're adding that nutrition to the soil yourself and doing it on a regular basis. They're still going to get plenty. So having cleaned up this area, which was rather full of weeds, and roughly cultivated it, I'm now preparing to actually put some green manure in it. Now the green manure stage is only short. It's only going to be 4 to 6 weeks, because it grows quickly, and it's at the stage when it's around about 6 inches high that you want to actually get it back into the soil in some way. Now, what do you use? Because I'm coming into the cooler period of the year, I'm using a base of oats. Look, I prefer to use annuals in my green manure because it is much easier to get rid of them. You're not actually introducing something that is going to become a pest in the garden and stay there. If you use something like clover, some of the clovers can stay because they're perennial and you have an issue with them. But to this I'm going to add a legume. Now the legume that I have got here is some old broad bean seed. It's a couple of years, so how viable it's going to be I'm not sure, but some of it should germinate. Being cooler time of the year, I'm using the broad beans. If it was coming into a warmer time, I'd use peas. Now an easy way to actually get cheap pea seed is to buy the dried peas that you'd buy in the supermarket. They will actually work quite well also, but better for a warmer time of the year. To that I'm going to add some mustard seed. Now I again buy this from the spice rack, and a fair sprinkling of that into there will add some mustard. So mixing those up and then broadcasting that across and scratching it in, and in a few weeks it'll be coming up and looking good. What do you do once it's actually growing? The traditional thing is to actually dig that back into the soil, you know, to plough it in or to dig it in with a shovel or fork, but I don't always like to do that. The time of the year now means that it's actually going to be probably quite wet once it's ready to go back into the soil, so not a good time to actually cultivate the soil. So my preference actually is to use black plastic over it. First I would probably scythe it down and then put black plastic over it, and the worms will come up and take it back down into the soil for you. If you're able to actually bring your chickens, your hens into the garden, they will enjoy some of that green pick and donate some nitrogen in return. I'm not actually able to do that at this stage. It's something I want to be able to achieve but not quite ready for. But whichever way, yeah, get it back into the soil quickly. Don't let it go to flower or seed, because at that point you're actually losing some of the benefits.